All right, so welcome to another deep dive. And today we are going to look at Larry Ralston, a serial killer from Ohio in the 1970s.
Oh, interesting.
We've got his Wikipedia page and some old newspaper articles. So we're
Okay.
going to cover his background, the murders themselves, and kind of how he was eventually caught and convicted.
It's going to be a fascinating one for sure. I mean, the thing that always strikes me about these cases is just how normal these guys seem, you know?
Yeah, and I think that's what we're going to find here because there isn't a whole lot of info about his childhood. He was born in 49, pretty typical, it seems.
Right, right.
Graduated high school, was in the army, seems like a normal guy, right?
Yeah, totally. But then, by 1977, he was unemployed and living with his parents.
Yeah, red flag, right?
Well, I mean, it could be a sign of some underlying frustration, maybe a trigger for his crimes.
Maybe, but maybe not. I mean, lots of people are unemployed, living at home. Doesn't mean they become serial killers.
You're absolutely right. It's way more complicated than that. But it's still something to consider. Like, was there a snapping point?
Right, I guess.
Yeah.
So where should we start, I guess, with the victims?
Yeah, let's start there.
So the first one is Linda K. Harmon. She was just 17, disappeared on her way to school in 1975.
17, wow.
Sadly, they only found skeletal remains, like scattered over a pretty big area.
God, that's awful. And her parents actually, they offered a reward for information 6 months after they found the remains.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, it makes you wonder if they suspected someone they knew.
Tragic.
Really sad.
Okay, so then in 76, we've got Nancy Grigsby. She was 22. She vanished while out on a walk, and the sources mention that she was known to hitchhike.
Hitchhiking, huh? Okay, so that could be significant. We know that a lot of serial killers target people who, they perceive as vulnerable.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And hitchhikers, especially women, they definitely fit that profile.
Right. And just a few months after that, Mary Ruth Hopkins is found murdered. The details are just brutal. Bruised face, hair torn out,
Jeez.
and it seems they used her own tank top as a ligature.
Oh man. So it's not just a killing, it's personal, right? Like there's rage involved.
Yeah, absolutely. So then in 77, there's Elena Bear.
Okay.
She and a friend, Debbie, were hitchhiking. Ralston picked them up. He let Debbie go unharmed.
Huh.
But Elena was found later, strangled in a freak bed.
That's so creepy, the fact that he let the friend go. I mean, that suggests he's choosing his victims very deliberately.
Yeah, like he's in control.
Yeah, exactly. It's chilling.
And then just a few months after that, Diane Sue McCroby, she was 16, went missing after a date, and her remains were found months later. And her story is very similar to the others, but there's a twist with her case. Her address book ends up being super important.
Her address book.
Yeah.
Wow. That's an interesting twist. I mean, I guess it just goes to show that even the smallest detail can be crucial.
Yeah, for sure. And so then in September of 77, three teenage girls, they report being abducted and raped. And the sources mentioned that at this point, police were already investigating the murders of like 12 women in the area.
Wow. So they knew they had a serious problem on their hands.
Yeah, like maybe a serial killer.
Right. And were they thinking that Ralston might be responsible for even more than they knew about at that point?
Maybe, yeah. That's scary. And we should probably talk about how common it is for these guys to escalate.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, in these cases, it's all about recognizing the patterns in behavior.
Right. So how do they catch them?
Well, so those girls, they're the ones who actually identified Alston.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, pretty brave of them. And that led to his arrest in November of 77.
Wow, amazing. So they were the key.
Absolutely. And then the investigators, they find Ralston's name in Diane McCroby's address book.
Oh, right. I forgot about that.
And that's when everything really starts to come together.
Wow. What a story.
Yep, and it's just getting started.
I bet. Okay, well, I guess we should take a break and then come back to this.
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay.
It's kind of crazy how quickly things start moving after that. I mean, his trial for Elena Bear's murder starts in April 78.
Wow. So less than a year after he's arrested.
Yeah, exactly. And the jury finds him guilty in May.
That's pretty quick.
It is, yeah, and they sentenced him to death, scheduled to be executed in October of the same year.
Wow. So much happening in such a short time.
Right. But hold on, because while all this is going on, he's also convicted in July of killing Diane McCroby, sentenced to life in prison for that.
Okay, so he's on death row for one murder and sentenced to life for another.
Yep, that's right.
And then what? They just kind of put the execution on hold while they sort out the other charges?
Yeah, pretty much. But then in July of 78, the U.S. Supreme Court, they rule that Ohio's death penalty is unconstitutional.
Oh, wow, that's huge.
Yeah, so Ralston's death sentence for killing Elena Bear, that gets commuted to life in prison.
So he's basically off death row, but still serving life.
Exactly. And keep in mind, this is all happening in 78, right?
Crazy year. So 2 life sentences? Is that it?
Not even close. In August of 78, he's convicted of killing Linda Harmon, another life sentence. And then the same month, they find him guilty of Nancy Grigsby's murder. So that's 4 life sentences now.
Gee, so he's just wrapping him up. And on top of that, I see here that he pled guilty in September 78 to 2 counts of rape.
Yeah, got 2 concurrent sentences of 7 to 25 years for those.
Man, 1978 was a busy year for this guy. But there's this one thing I don't get it. Like, in November of 79, his conviction for Nancy Grigsby's murder, that gets overturned.
Oh, right.
Yeah, so how does that happen?
Well, sometimes new evidence comes to light, or there are issues with the original investigation. Maybe forensic science has advanced since the trial, things like that.
So it's possible some of the other convictions could be overturned too.
It's not very likely, but I guess it's possible each case would have to be looked at again individually. New evidence, new science, it all depends.
God, can you imagine what that would be like for the families to go through all of that again?
I know, it's awful. I mean, they deserve some peace, some closure.
Totally. Okay, so back to Ralston. He's serving 4 life sentences plus time for the rates. But then in 1984, he pleads guilty to killing Mary Ruth Hopkins.
Oh, wow, the victim from the Lover's Lane, right?
Yep, another life sentence.
So why confess years later? I mean, what's the point? He's already never getting out of prison.
Right, it's kind of bizarre. Maybe he felt guilty finally.
Maybe. Or maybe he wanted to control the narrative, get his version of the story out there.
Possibly. I mean, we'll probably never know for sure. So where are we now? He's still in prison, right?
Yep, still at Madison Correctional Institution. And he's been denied parole multiple times, most recently in 2018.
So they're not letting him out. That's good.
Yeah, I think everyone agrees that he's too dangerous to be released.
Definitely. We've talked a lot about Ralston and the crimes and the trials, but what about the victims, their families?
You're right. We need to remember them, too. They are the real victims in all of this.
Exactly. I mean, it's easy to get caught up in the true crime aspect of it all, but these were real people with families and friends, and their lives were touched.
It's important to keep that in mind, yeah. Their stories need to be remembered, not just Ralston's story.
And their families, they had to deal with the aftermath of these crimes, the grief, the loss.
Absolutely. It's hard to imagine what they went through.
Yeah, it's tragic. And then there's the whole thing with Nancy Grigsby's conviction being overturned. Like, what does that do to her family?
I know. It brings up all the pain and uncertainty again.
Yeah. It just seems like the justice system can be so flawed sometimes.
It can be, yeah. It's a difficult balance, trying to get it right, to hold people accountable, but also to make sure that innocent people aren't punished.
Right, and then you think about the time period, the 1970s. A lot was changing for women then.
Oh, absolutely. The women's liberation movement, a lot of new freedoms, but also new dangers.
Yeah. Like hitchhiking, it was pretty common back then, but it made women vulnerable.
Sadly, yeah.
So did that contribute to Ralston crimes? Like, was it easier for him to target women because of these societal shifts?
Well, it's hard to say for sure. I mean, we have to be careful not to blame the victims.
Of course, yeah.
But it's certainly something to think about, like how these changes in society might have created opportunities for someone like Ralston.
Right, right. It's like progress for women is great, but did it come at a cost?
It's a complex issue. I mean, we can't just say, oh, women are more free now, so it's their own fault if they become victims. That's ridiculous.
No, of course not. But we can't ignore the reality of the situation either.
Absolutely. I mean, the 1970s was a time of huge social change, and there were bound to be growing pains. But it's important to remember that women were and still are disproportionately victims of violence.
Yeah. And Ralston, he was a product of his time, I guess, but he still made his own choices.
Exactly. We can't excuse his actions just because of the societal context, but understanding that context can help us to understand the bigger picture, maybe even prevent something like this from happening again.
Right. Okay, so we've covered a lot. Ralston's background, the murders, the trials, the impact on the victims and their families, even the societal context. It's heavy stuff.
It is, yeah. But it's important to talk about these things.
Totally. And I think it all comes back to that one question, why? Why did he do it?
I know. It's the question everyone wants answered. But sometimes there just isn't a clear answer.
Yeah, we want to believe that there's some easy explanation, some sign we could have seen, but it's not always that simple.
Right. I mean, we can look at things like, his childhood, his psychology, but it's never just one thing.
Right. So I guess what I'm hearing is that we're not going to get all the answers.
Maybe not. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't keep asking the questions. Trying to understand, trying to learn from them.
Yeah. I mean, maybe by looking at cases like this, we can learn how to prevent them in the future.
Exactly. And even if we can't prevent every tragedy, at least we can try to make sense of them, honor the victims, and maybe, just maybe, make the world a little bit safer.
Yeah, I like that. It's tough, right? Like we want to learn about these cases, but we also don't want to like sensationalize them or anything.
Yeah, exactly. It's about finding that balance. We need to acknowledge the horror of what happened, but we also need to remember the victims, the families.
Yeah. And that kind of brings us back to that question we keep coming back to. Why? Why'd he do it? I mean, we've looked at so much, but his background, what was going on in society back then, how his crimes got like worse over time, but is there really an answer? Like, can we ever really know?
That's the thing, right? We want like a simple explanation, some obvious warning sign, but these things are way more complicated than that.
Yeah.
There's all sorts of factors that can play into it. Could be genetics or some kind of trauma when he was a kid. Could be a psychological disorder, or maybe it's how he was raised. Who knows? The environment, the people around him. But it's never just one thing.
Right. So are we basically saying we'll never understand what was going on in his head? Like what actually made him do these awful things?
We may never have all the answers, but that doesn't mean we should stop looking for them. Researching these cases, figuring out patterns. Maybe that way we can learn to spot the warning signs, try to prevent it from happening again.
It's like we're trying to solve this puzzle, but we're missing some pieces.
Yeah, exactly. But even if we can't get the whole picture, every little piece we find helps us get a little bit closer.
Yeah, I guess so. But it's still pretty disturbing. I mean, think about all we've talked about today. His background, all the murders, the investigations, trials, the overturned conviction, the families, all that stuff about like the 70s.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in.
It is, and it's hard to forget that we're talking about real people, real tragedies here.
That's so important to remember.
Yeah, for sure. It's easy to get caught up in the whole like true crime thing, but we can't forget that these were real people with lives and families and, they're gone.
Yeah, and their stories are important. Those are the stories we need to remember, not
Yeah,
not just the killer's story.
exactly. Okay, well, I think we've covered just about everything. This has been well, it's been a tough one,
It has.
but also important.
Absolutely. I mean, we've got to talk about these things, even though they're hard.
Yeah, and I really hope people listening learned something today, about this case and maybe even about themselves.
I hope so, too. It's all about understanding, right? Trying to make sense of these things and hopefully making the world a little bit better, a little bit safer.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. So that's it for this deep dive. Thanks for joining us, and we'll be back next time with another case. Until then, stay curious, stay informed, and yeah, stay safe out there.